Hi, today I'm gonna show you how to turn this little background illustration into a nice animation like this with gritty textured smoke. All of this completely in the RoughAnimator app without ever leaving it. Let's get started. I'm gonna show you 3 ways how to achieve this effect. First the naive one and then 2 better ones. But first let's quickly go through the setup of the project. We have the layer 1, which is an imported image that I painted in Procreate and imported here. Create one layer above and call it Smoke 1. This is where we'll be drawing our first smoke effect. So let's continue with the naive way. We just need a proper grainy brush and then we can achieve a nice grainy effect, right? So let's select the dust brush. You can find this brush for free in my brush pack that you can download below. If you need help importing brushes, check out my other tutorial that I will try to link here. So let's set the size to around 160 pixels to preserve the texture of the brush. Let's leave the opacity at 100% and set the spacing to a high amount, around 100 pixels, to actually really preserve this effect of the graininess. And the last thing we need to do is actually pick a color. And let's pick a color from the image that's already there so it doesn't seem out of place. So some dark color like this one. Now let's paint in the smoke on our smoke layer 1. I will fast forward the time. Okay, now let's preview what we got. The graininess is already nice, but the shape itself is kinda fuzzy. If you look at clouds or smoke, usually the shape is very solid, so it has rough edges. So we want only the grainy effect inside. How do we do this? So now one option would be to go back in with an eraser tool and delete the edges and make them more sharp. And the result of it looks like this. Not too bad. But I will show you a better way. This will be my method number 2 and one of my favorite methods. Let's create a new layer and call it Smoke 2. Then let's hide our first layer by turning the opacity down to 0. Okay, next we want to select a hard brush. So the normal round brush tip shape, a brush size of around 10 pixels, opacity of 100%, and a low spacing, not more than 20. So with this one we can draw normal lines basically. So let's go ahead and paint the smoke outlines. My trick here is to imagine there are sine waves coming out of the chimney and they're slowly moving along. I'm moving rather quick here, so I'm not very accurate. Be sure to close all the gaps in the outlines, so we can fill this form later. Okay, now let's select the fill tool and fill it with the color we have already. But do you see this little white edge here? We don't want this artifact. So, to prevent this from happening, what we need is to set the fill expand to something about 3 pixels, maybe 5. It should not be bigger than the brush size or the size of the line that you've drawn. Okay, so now let's fill all the other frames as well. Okay, let's see what we have. Looks good enough. Now comes the fun part. So we will be applying some additional color on top of this layer. But because we don't want to work destructive, let's duplicate the Smoke 2 layer and work on this duplicated layer. Let's turn the opacity of our original Smoke 2 layer down for now. Now we will go back to the dust brush from before. Maybe you were so smart to save it, and then you can just go back and load it back up, or just set it again to these values: 160 pixels, 100% opacity, 100 spacing, no smoothing, and randomized rotation, don't forget that. And now, the important thing, you set the draw mode to draws inside. This is the crucial part here. Set it to draw inside because we want to draw inside the cloud now. And this is the whole trick to it. Now if you draw on this layer, it will not spill out beyond the boundaries that you have already drawn. It is basically like alpha lock in other applications like Procreate or Photoshop. So now let's go ahead and apply this texturized look frame by frame to every single frame. And here's the result. That is the second method. It looks pretty great. There's a nice randomness to it because every frame looks a bit different. It has this gritty, handmade feel. Pretty cool, right? So this is one of my favorite techniques and I use it all the time. But you remember, I also promised you a third technique. So what is the third technique for? The only downside of the second technique that I showed you is that you don't have transparency. What you can do is put the transparency down of the whole layer, but maybe you don't want to reduce the whole transparency. Maybe you just want some holes in the smoke itself. So maybe it has varying densities in different areas. So you have some translucency at some places and less translucency at others. So for this case, I have my third method. And again, let's go ahead and create another layer and call it Smoke 3. And this time, let's paint our smoke in another area. So let's say there's a chimney right here. Now if the smoke goes up from here, you see it will overlap all these buildings behind it. But we don't want to completely lose all this information in the background. We still want some of it to shine through. So again, let's start like before. Let's go back to our hard brush and paint the smoke in frame by frame. We don't need to go all the way to the top because some of it we'll erase. So let's just round it off in the top. So we have to draw less because we're lazy. When it comes to animation time, it's always good to cut some corners. Okay, now that we have this done, let's again duplicate this layer so we don't delete anything and we can always go back. Now the trick for method 3 is that instead of a brush, we will use an eraser. And we will gradually erase from the top to the bottom. So we kind of create the grainy gradient. Yeah. Okay, let's go through the settings of the eraser. Let's again select our dust brush tip for the eraser. Enable randomized rotation. Set the eraser size to something large again, like 175 pixels. Set the opacity to 50%, spacing to 100, and no smoothing again. And now let's start. We start erasing from the top to erase slowly the round tip so it just dissipates and goes over in a gradient from smoke to nothingness. And then as we go lower down, we try to make this effect more and more subtle until in the end it's solid smoke, more or less. And then again, we apply this frame by frame to each of our frames. And there it is. There's the result. You can see the smoke now has this translucency. At the same time, it has this grittiness. And yeah, it just seems much more dynamic and gritty and nice. And I just like it. Yeah, and that's it. That's my third and last method that I use. So now we can look at this image in full glory, zoom out and see the entire background animation. And we can just imagine it could be a nice backdrop to some historical documentary style or World War or steampunk setting. And the whole grittiness of the smoke helps it blend in with the rest of the illustration and animation style. So I have used these techniques in a couple of my own animations, and I hope they will help you also fulfill your creative vision and maybe not to leave the RoughAnimator app if you just want to apply some gritty texture to something or some effect that you can achieve with these 3 methods that I've shown you, because you can use this to achieve a varying number of different effects. And don't forget, you can get this brush and different other brushes with other textures in my brush pack below. Leave a tip if you like, but otherwise it's completely free. So this is it in regards to the learning and teaching part of this tutorial. I hope you liked it. I hope you create something awesome with the methods I've shown you. As always, share with me whatever you created. I'm really curious. Here are my Twitter and Instagram handles. And if you want, stay with me and I'll show you some examples where I use these techniques in my personal and client projects. So let's open up some of my other projects where I use these kind of techniques, and I will show you how exactly I use them. So let's open up first this one. This is like a car that drives along a street. It's like kind of a bumpy street at night. And I used it here in 2 places. One place, as you can see, it's the headlights, the light ray. I used like I think it's the same dust brush that I used here to also apply that grain to it. And something that's very cool, and it's not obvious at first how I used it, but in the reflection, it's the same thing. I first drew the road, but then I drew on top of it with a special brush that I just created to reproduce this effect. I created the brush like... actually, I deleted it already, but it was basically a brush like this one that had horizontal lines, and then I disabled randomized rotation and was just drawing it in. So it stayed constantly in that orientation, and that's why it produced this cool reflection effect. Then I drew it basically frame by frame in, and I really like this wet road look. Yeah, this is one example. Another example is this one. This is an like Möbius inspired illustration that I got from a client, and he wanted it animated. And there's this airplane and UFO that fly in. So you see here the plane is flying in, and how I did it first, like the whole coloring process is I painted in the flat colors of the plane first, and then later on top of it I applied the camouflage and these little circles. And the draw inside mode helps you stay in the boundaries of the drawing that you've already done on the layer. So it's really helpful to do multiple passes of coloring when you do it completely in RoughAnimator. And the same thing I did for this little smoke trail. I first painted it in with one color, like the yellow one here, and then I took a very soft brush and applied this soft gradient on top of it with the soft brush. And you see, it looks like a perfect gradient, and I didn't have to leave RoughAnimator for it, which is pretty cool, I think. Another thing, yeah, and another short animation I did this year in the middle of the Corona crisis is this one. It's like a kind of like a drug lord or like a mafia boss sitting in a room, and here I used it again for the smoke effect to make the smoke effect grainy. You see, I also used it for the table, but it's mostly static there. And later on, here for example, here I used it to make this reflection a bit more interesting. Before it was just a flat color, but let me zoom in actually here. Before it was just a flat color, but with this shading applied, it looked pretty cool. And then also in the very end, I just used it here as a background. Yeah, so you see, I like to use that effect a lot because it brings a little bit more of personality into the shots that you use. And here's another project I used it on. This is like a teaser for a future project that I have in my mind that I want to make. And it's basically a painting that glows from the inside, and there's some wind coming from somewhere, maybe from the painting itself. How is it possible? I don't know. But anyway, I used it here for the shading, the highlights and the shadows, to also again stay inside of the curtain layer and not spill out. I used to draw inside. And another thing I used here for this effect, I used a special brush that I built myself basically just to produce this effect. And this is something you can play with, creating your own brushes to make certain effects possible. And then of course I used it in this little brush promo video to demonstrate all the different brushes and how they look like when you apply them. And all of the time I use this technique to apply it to the shadow and to the ball. Okay, I hope that gave you a little bit of extra inspiration and motivation to try it actually out for yourself. I'm definitely excited what others make with these techniques, and I'm looking forward to see it. So, like I said, tag me and I'll take a look. Now, the only thing left to say is subscribe.